Rich Yselson. He is a member of the editorial board of Dissent magazine. He worked in the labor movement for 23 years as a strategic campaigner. And he is returning to this program. I don't know if we see him yet. He is returning to this program. Hi, Rich. How are you?
Hi, Sam. How are you?
Well, I was just about to say that you're returning to this program, and I'm here with Emma Vigland.
Hi, Emma.
There. Hi.
Returning to this program, I think the last time we spoke was about maybe 8 years ago now, about you were writing about fortress unionism, and a very different time in where the unions were at in some respects. In many respects, we have just sort of moved down there, but there's been a lot of different sort of things that have happened since then. And I want to circle back to that as we talk about what happened in Bessemer, but characterize for us. I think we had one of the organizers on this program, I don't know, 4, 5 or 6 weeks ago. And there was a hopeful sense. And this was right after I think Biden had spoken out. Characterize for us just like the results, if you will, and then we will take it from there.
So the results were not obviously great. There were about 5,800 members of the unit, which is itself an important thing to discuss, how the unit sort of ballooned from 1,500 at the point when the union first filed its petition for an election to 5,800. And of that 5,800, perhaps 55% voted. There are about 500-600 votes that are still in dispute. Amazon mostly would, either side can challenge those votes. Amazon mostly challenged those, but of those votes that were free and clear, Amazon took about 70%, and pro-union workers took about 30%. So, that's a significant defeat in that there's a minimum requirement from the National Labor Relations Act if a union attempts to get an election that's supervised by the National Labor Relations Board, that they get 30% of the workers in the unit who sign cards and basically say, I'm interested in an election. That doesn't commit them to vote for the election. It doesn't commit them to ultimately be a pro-union advocate, but it does say, yes, I'm in favor of an election. So essentially, the pro-union side, ended up at the same 30%. And, again, this is something to discuss in terms of how this all went down. But generally speaking, unions they don't want to just petition for an election with 30%. Obviously, you need 50% plus one to win. But beyond that, because of the company tactics, which are, the people who sign the checks have the most influence on workers, and because the field is tilted overwhelmingly on behalf of the employer, it's not a fair fight. Unions generally, organizers I've spoken to generally want 60 to even 70% of workers signing cards before seeking an election.
All right. Well, I want to circle back into that just so that people understand, because I think some of this stuff seems fairly Byzantine for people, and it is in many respects.
Of course.
And we should say that practice of filling out the card to say I am interested in an election, like you say, it commits you to nothing. It just commits you to wanting to have an election. And there was an attempt, I guess it was like 13, 14 years ago, and there was a hope that the incoming Democratic majority in the Senate and House and in having the presidency when Barack Obama came in, that there was going to be a push for card check. And when we hear card check, that would have changed it from I sign a card to say I'm interested in an election to I sign a card to say I want to join the union. And there it's done and over with. Because that period of time between we signed the card saying we want an election and the election provides an enormous amount of time for a massive company like Amazon to influence the outcome of the vote. And it's a war of attrition, and necessarily they have more power. And so, but I want to circle back to that, because then the conversation of the PRO Act. So, okay. So you've hinted at this, and when the union did the card, they did the sort of apply for a union, had people sign cards for this election. They thought the unit was one size, and it turned out to be another. Explain to us, like, what is this? What does a unit mean? And then, like, how? Like, then walk us through what happened.
Well, a unit means what the National Labor Relations Board deems to be a bargaining unit, meaning bargaining is the key adjective there. In other words, these are workers that have enough in common with each other that when you put them all together, they would constitute an entity that, if they were to affirm the right to unionization, they would be entitled to collective bargaining rights. So that becomes, and this is very standard, this is nothing that Amazon had a superpower about. This is a standard company move. When a union signs up and says, okay, in this case, we have 1,500 workers in the unit as we define it, the company will try to do two things. A, dilute the union, the unit, by claiming many more workers have a right to be in it. In this case, in Amazon's case, they were already hiring an enormous amount of workers to deal with the COVID crisis. I mean, something like, they almost increased by half their number of workers in the United States over the past year of the COVID crisis. So these are effectively, where a lot of these workers were temporary workers, but they have been added all over the country, including Bessemer. Then there can be controversies about who is a supervisor versus who is a supervised employee. I mean, classic example of that is with a charge nurse. Is a charge nurse a supervisor, or is she just like the nurses that she supervises? She's obviously not a part of the management of the hospital, but doesn't mean that she not entitled to be in the bargaining unit. So in this case, Amazon said, look, we have all these people we think, they should be in the unit. In their case, they wanted supervisors to be in the unit. It can go either way. And all these temp workers. So what started out as 1,500, Amazon suit said, no, we've got 5,800, and we need to have a hearing before the National Labor Relations Board to adjudicate all of this. And of course, the purpose of a hearing is to slow everything down even more and create, concern, anxiety, worry among the workers. In other words, no rush to judgment. No, make it bigger, dilute the activists like the organizer you had on your show, dilute their power, because their power in 5,800 is far different than their power with 1,500. And then slow the whole thing down. Let's have a hearing and talk about it. Amazon did this, right out of the playbook. Companies all over the country do it. Obviously, they have more power and sophistication than pretty much any company, with a rare exception. But this is the standard play.
Now, it was.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just curious. Was there something specific to the Bessemer facility and just the workforce there that made them more susceptible to these kinds of slowdowns in terms of just Amazon's interference? Was there something about that specific Amazon warehouse that made them vulnerable to these tactics? I
don't think so. I mean, again, you really have to, to be sure, you'd have to really talk to the organizers on the ground and the RWDSU, the Retail and Wholesale Distribution Workers Union that organized it. But I don't think there was anything unique to that unit compared to, like, say, any other Amazon unit, or really probably any other workplace unit that would make them susceptible. The thing is that structurally, the size of the unit changed enormously, and things slowed down. In fact, from what we could tell about that unit, the activists, the people who first got in touch with the organizing union, they're a strong lot. And they probably, in fact, a lot of them, from what you could tell from the reporting on the ground, and also about Amazon, this is a big part of something to discuss here, was really excellent. That's like a silver lining that came out of this. We know a lot more about how Amazon does what it does, and it's the most emblematic company in all of what I called capitalist modernity in a piece I recently wrote in Jacobin. So that's valuable. That's a silver lining here. We wouldn't have had that without this campaign. But, you know, Amazon did what it did and would have done it anywhere, but the actual activists, a lot of them came out of, from what we could tell, other union shops in the area. In fact, some of them were making even more than $15 an hour in other similar places. Amazon, you know, made a big claim, hey, we're at the Bernie Sanders rate. We're at $15 an hour, which was correct, you know. And some of them were in unions. And so the activists themselves really understood their own minds. The difficulty is that the activists themselves, it's not even, I mean, who knows? It's not even clear they could have gotten to 50% with 1,500, although that would have been a lot more of a fair fight. We'll never know. But 5,800 changed the dynamic completely.
What is the best practice? And I mean, I know the answer to this, at least in terms of, like, you know, what you've written and what Jane McAlevey has written, which you cite in your piece as well. She has a piece in The Nation magazine. The best practices are that when you are faced with that type of, I mean, I guess it makes sense to me that, like, if I'm working at a place and there's 6,000 people who are doing a similar job to me, like, I wouldn't necessarily, there's no way for me to know that necessarily. I don't know. I mean, I'm looking around and you know, particularly from what I understand about working in Amazon, it's like, I work this aisle and that's it. Every day I work this aisle.
Work.
I have no idea if it's not like we all meet at the commissary at the same time and we get a head
they're
count.
working with robots frequently. They're not even engaging with other human beings. It's very alienating work.
So I understand how they wouldn't, you know, this could come as a surprise, but what is the best practice for union organizers when you find out that a unit is actually 3 times the size, 4 times the size that you thought it was, and you know that you're already starting with, you know, a limited, you know, a concentration of activists, and the fact that the unit is 3 times the size, you don't necessarily have intel or people on the ground or activists embedded in that other, you know, 3/4 of the unit. What's the best practice at that point?
Well, I don't think there necessarily is a best practice. There's just a strategic analysis that has to be made, sort of a power structure analysis, like evaluating the strength of the union, the strength of the worker activists that support the union versus the strength of the company. And it's more like there's a choice that's put before the union, and that choice happened in this case. And the choice was, you can go to once Amazon says to the National Labor Relations Board, oh, we want a hearing. Oh, this is not 1,500. Oh no, there's 5,800 people here. We can count them and we can show them to you. At that point, the union has a choice. It can go to the hearing and fight that. And then there'll be a delay, obviously, and discussion of that. And weeks go by. And while those weeks are going on, Amazon is incorporating its union busting strategy with group and individual meetings with the union, with the workers. And of course, keep in mind that the union doesn't have the right to go into the shop and sort of set up its own thing. And this would be like as if you had a presidential election. So you had, you know, Biden and Trump, and Biden wasn't allowed to go into like Trump's strongholds. So Biden couldn't go to Florida. You know, only Trump could go there, or vice versa. You know, Trump couldn't go to a Biden stronghold. So at that point, the union can either say, okay, we're going to fight this. We're going to try to reduce this number. We'll get it down to whatever they think is, we'll try to get it down to 1,500 again. Or they can say, the delay is our enemy. That's playing on the union, playing on the company's terms. So we're just going to go right into the fight and try to expedite the election as quickly as possible, despite the fact that we're overwhelmed here. And in other words, stipulate to the 5,800, which in this case is what the union did. Or the third choice is, we can't win this one now. Once they move to 5,800, we're doing our power structure analysis. It's awful for the activists. It sucks for us to have to pull back, but we can't win it. We just can't win it. And we're going to withdraw our petition now and try to extend our fight and build more strength and then fight another day. Those were the three choices.
There's also been criticism that I have read in various places. And some people were not on the ground. Some people were who have commented on this, but reporters that I know who are on the ground, like you, or I read, I should say, who are on the ground, say there also wasn't necessarily the groundwork laid in terms of just an appreciation of what the union could do. Now, I know you weren't necessarily there on the ground either.
I wasn't.
And so it's hard. It's hard to assess this. But broadly speaking, like, do you have a sense of whether this was, to make the decision that they made, which was option 2, I guess, stipulate and go forward. You have to be pretty confident at that point. I mean, because, like you said at the beginning of this interview, most union organizers like to see 60 to 70% of a unit sign those cards. As you wrote in your piece, the idea is that, like, you never gain when you're going up against these other four. You're never going to gain more supporters of the union. You're just going to try and staunch the bleeding of support until you get across the line. And so what can you, I guess, glean in terms of like the groundwork that was laid for unionization there?
Well, let me say broadly, it was a new plant. So in other words, it was a year old. I mean, it's about a year old now. I think it was opened up, I think, in March 2020. And so you've got a bunch of new workers. They don't know each other. It's not a quote unquote mature workforce at that plant. So what happens is that, or what apparently happened in this case is you have some activists, they want the union, which is great. Obviously, that's the foundation for everything. Without militant workers who actually want a union, given how hard it is to get one in the United States, more difficult than any other advanced country in the world by far, the most anti-union employer class by far. You have to have that. But when you have a plant where there's a bunch of new workers coming in, they don't know each other, they haven't worked with each other, it's more difficult to sort of pull them together into a cohesive majoritarian unit. Now, having said that, I think that's basically a secondary issue here. I think that becomes, I mean, criticism, whatever, it's fair enough. These are the people I've read, they're all like smart, knowledgeable people inside the union, either inside the labor movement or experts on the labor movement or really smart reporters. But I think that's kind of a sideshow. I think there's two fundamental issues here. One is the one we've discussed. Can you even do this at all once the unit is increased almost fourfold? Like, can you win, basically? And, do you accept delay? Do you go forward as I did and get beaten very badly? Or do you sort of say, better to retreat now and then build strength? Then the second more macro question is, can you organize a company like Amazon with starting in just one, even fairly large warehouse, when there's 110 warehouses in the United States, in 42 states, and there are 750,000 to 800,000 workers. And so even at 6,000, most of the temps will say, that's under 1% of the entire workforce of Amazon. So can you even do it this way? I mean, that's what the eminent, like the most eminent labor historian in the United States, one of the great historians, period, Nelson Lichtenstein, called trench warfare, quote unquote, in my home journal of dissent. So can you do trench warfare? In other words, if we're sort of talking about how they pull the unit together, we're talking about the nuances of trench warfare. And maybe trench warfare isn't even, I believe trench warfare isn't even the way to think about this.
All right. So this is an important point, because you cited in your piece the Flint, the famous Flint, Michigan strike, which essentially unionized GM. And you compared and contrast based upon the number of workers at the Flint, Michigan plant in terms of what they represented. GM had the same sort of percentage equivalent roughly, to Amazon, roughly, but their concentration of their workers was far more concentrated in 4 or 5 or 6 different places. And so when you unionized one shop, you have unionized a massive percentage, relatively speaking, to their entire workforce. And that fundamentally alters the equation. And so why is it harder to work? I mean, it may seem obvious to you, but I don't know if it is to most folks. Why is trench warfare harder in this instance?
Well, let me just step back very quickly to the GM example, because if anything, I undersold it in the piece, which I regret doing. And this is part of like the brilliance of that strategy, and strategy and figuring out where the leverage points are is crucial for unions, given how difficult it is to pull any of this off in the first place, especially against emblematic companies like GM then or Amazon now. Yes, as I said, that was almost 25% of the total workforce of the company just in a Flint area, several Flint plants. But just as importantly, arguably even more importantly, GM couldn't make cars elsewhere without Flint. In other words, it wasn't just the number of employees. It was that like all the engines for, I think, Chevy cars came out of the Flint plants. It's that most of the tool and die, sort of the template for establishing each car, most of the tool and die work came out of those like interrelated Flint plants. So in other words, they could stop the whole company and control almost 25% of the workers, but also effectively stop the whole company from producing cars there. There isn't one given Amazon warehouse where that's possible. So to answer your subsequent question, you can't leverage the company's distribution of its product with just one plant, and B, you're hoping, and maybe I'm not sure if this is true or not, to be honest, but maybe in the era of social media, there's a possibility this is true. You're sort of hoping that there'll be like a sort of a spread like wildfire effect, where activists in other units will be inspired by the victory in the first unit. But at 110 facilities, and not including the 75 elsewhere, which enables them to keep going all over the world, the 75 other warehouse distribution centers, like to sort of bet on that, I don't think it's a good bet. Like, I understand the activists on the ground want that, and that's why it's a complicated equation for the union and for the labor movement generally. So I'm not being particularly critical. I'm just saying this is a very hard calculation to make, and I don't think you can pull it off doing like trench warfare. Okay, we've got Bessemer, and now we move to Sheboygan, Wisconsin. I don't know if there's one there. Right. Now we move to Omaha, Nebraska, and I don't think that's an effective a lightly effective strategy. Let me put it that way.
So how do you establish a national strategy then, right? Where there's coordination? Is it the difference in the union representation, or, what, like a stronger, like larger national union, or what is it?
Well, sure. I mean, that helps. I mean, with the UAW in 1936, 37 in Flint, the UAW itself was very small at that time. It had maybe 25,000 members, 30,000 members, but it had the United Mine Workers Union of John L. Lewis and the about to be newly formed CIO unions behind them. And John L. Lewis didn't just have a lot of clout through the mine workers, who really were fully organized and controlled 60% of the energy in the country at that point, which is far cry from what coal mining does today. But he had a bank, the National Bank of Washington, and he had a lot of money to spend on organizers and all that. So they had that. So sure, one part of it is you need like a kind of a really large union, probably a strategically savvy union. Obviously, the full support of the rest of the labor movement, to the extent that's possible, the logistics of that, where the unions have to work together on this common project. But then you also need, and again, this speaks to, again, the Flint GM comparison, you need to understand the leverage points. So there's like a top-down strategy. So you also need to have, in other words, people looking at like the whole company business model. Like where is the company vulnerable in a regulatory sense? Where is the company vulnerable legislatively? Where is bad, just intense media scrutiny, which I think can be overestimated in terms of its impact on people who are just determined to block unions, because they can ride out a lot of bad publicity, as opposed to things that really concretely cost them money or stop production, like in the Flint example. But still, where is like constant scrutiny for a branded product like Amazon essentially is? The Amazon brand is essential. Like, where is bad publicity there actually going to like have a national effect? And then you're trying to like sort of do what's described as an air war and a ground war at the same time. Well, Bessemer was clearly an example of the ground war.
Right.
But you have this air war, and then you hope that, sure, there'll be activists in facilities all over the country, so your ground war also expands.
I mean, the point of Amazon not having basically a linear supply line in the way it structures its business, where GM did. And in fact, we had a couple of guests on a couple of years ago. I've cited this book many times, called Wrecked, which talked about how the car industry specifically went to change their supply lines to more like on-demand supplies, as opposed to for that very reason, to disempower a small shop from shutting down the entire production line.
Right. Or even a large shop like Flint.
Or a large shop, but you don't want some outfit that employs 15 people and making ball bearings that, if they stop, your whole production stops. And so and
of course, by then, the UAW had already organized GM. So, then you're just talking about how effective strikes are. But the organization had been done. In this case, of course, the challenge is to even get in the door and organize.
So I want to just sort of like, so if that's the case, I mean, if trying to figure out like where it is, like what group of people could be unionized that could actually seriously handicap Amazon's business model, at least, not the servers, maybe the servers, that's where they make a lot of their money, particularly before this past year, frankly. I want to just turn to another thing that you sort of touched on in your piece, which was that we have laborism without the labor. And it's talking about what, on the same day that I talked about Bessemer, the tech people at the New York Times had unionized or had talked about the Brookings Institute had
Yes.
unionized.
Right.
And that's like, that's great. But it's also like, as you write in your piece, that's not enough. But is there, like, how important is this sort of like quasi white collar or white collar unionization, you know, in terms of, because if I want to shut down Amazon, I'm going to do it. I'm going to like stop servicing their servers. I'm not going to do any of the sort of, I imagine, the tremendous amount of like, work that has to go on to make the site function. I mean, if I want to shut them down in that way, right?
Right. So a couple of things. The laborism issue. Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about and I've written about for 5, 6, 7 years now. And essentially, I do believe it's ideologically very important. I mean, in fact, you could argue that the Biden video, which I think is a very important document, FDR never came close to ever affirming unionism in that way. There were like apocryphal statements attributed to him, but he never did anything like that. And that video, because of modern technology, can be used in organizing campaigns as long as Biden is president. It went way beyond Bessemer. It affirmed the right of industrial democracy, workers choosing their right to self-organize. But what you've got is, right, people like yourself, like me, like all of us, not all of us, but many people probably watching this, who are, mostly urban, mostly cosmopolitan, mostly college educated or more. And post the 2008 recession, frequently youngish. And post the 2008 recession, these folks felt like they're being squeezed in the new media. They're being squeezed in academia and in nonprofits. And they start to both affirm unions as an ideological commitment, like unionism, labor is good, but also saying in our own workplaces, and that's where everybody starts. There's nothing wrong with that. Your own workplace, we're going to organize. The thing is, like with the Brookings example is a classic one. Like Brookings, those workers were actually citing reports against Brookings that Brookings had written supporting unions. So they're saying, hey, you guys, hey, you eggheads here, you intellectuals, actually we're intellectuals too, but that's fine. We're all eggheads here. You guys are supporting unions. Hey, but don't you do that for your own shop? Don't you do that for this workplace? That's obviously not something that the average Amazon worker can do, or the average at the Amazon workplace. That's not something, in other words, that kind of jujitsu, rhetorical and ideological jujitsu, most workers can't pull off. So like on one hand, it's a very important thing. On the other hand, you might be right about the servers, but broadly, you have to sort of think what could pressure them. That could be one thing. Again, Nelson Lichtensteiner, I mentioned before, the Washington Post piece I linked to about antitrust action against Amazon, comparing it to what happened with A&P during the New Deal era and beyond in the 1940s, basically saying, hey, basically Congress people sort of saying, oh, A&P is basically screwing local shops, local markets, local stores by pricing them out of the market because the local stores can compete with A&P. So we're gonna so then the unions get involved and sort of say, hey, here's the deal. You either get your whole company busted and decomposed by Wright Patman and the congressional people on his side in Congress, or you organize unions with us. And then we the unions will actually oppose the antitrust actions in return. So the workers got organized, and A&P kept its not a monopoly, oligopoly. So in other words, that's a kind of laborism too. It's basically like an ideological advance guard, and bless them, this is great. They're workers too, of more cosmopolitan, more urban, more educated workers, the graduate students at Harvard, the New Yorker writers, or New Yorker editors, I guess, and editorial assistants are organizing. I mean, these are the kind of shops, as you say, Times High Tech. It's just different than GM in 1930 or United Steel in 1936, 37, or Amazon or Walmart today. They're just not, or FedEx. They're just not enormous enough to have weight in the economy. But there's still tremendous value in what they're doing, I think.